evening to you. Sarah Jane Trent has just broken down on the stand. And tell us what it is about the line of questioning that she is struggling to explain.
That's correct, Xoli. The first that we've seen scenes like this play out before Parliament's ad hoc committee, where a witness actually breaks down before the inquisitorial body. And you'll remember that even when we spoke to her in the morning, she was expressing her sense of saying that she was nervous to appear before the inquisitorial body. And now what has really gotten her to this particular point is her essentially failure to explain how the herself, that is Sarah Jane Trent, as well as Paul O'Sullivan, got involved in some of the investigations that were taking place at IPID. Now, she has been at pains to actually explain, or has been struggling to explain, how that came to be. What we're seeing here is that in her statement, she has highlighted certain provisions that allow for the kind of interaction that she, as well as Paul O'Sullivan, would have had or Forensic for Justice would have had with members of IPID, particularly the late Mandla Mahlangu. And what she has essentially done by doing that is to then be forced to explain how the provisions that she has highlighted essentially empower the actions or her conduct, as well as the conduct of Paul O'Sullivan in their engagements with IPID officials. What she's done, Xoli, and I'm just going to read this particular provision, Section 24 of the IPID Act. That is Section 24, subsection 3A. And what it says is that for the purposes of conducting an investigation, an investigator may direct any person to submit an affidavit or affirmed declaration, or to appear before him or her to give evidence, to produce any document in that person's possession or under his or her control, which has a bearing on the matter being investigated, and may question such person thereon. And we suspect that this is one of the provisions, or we heard that this is one of the provisions that she has relied upon. But a reading of this particular provision, Xoli, to us does not indicate that an investigator may actually confer upon a private person the powers that would be afforded to an investigator. This particular provision, as I read it, speaks about the powers of the investigating officer. So it doesn't speak about the powers of an investigator to actually empower or confer upon a private person the powers that are in the statute conferred upon the investigator within IPID. And so that is what she has been asked to explain before the inquisitorial body, and that is why we find ourselves at this particular point. In fact, the EFF's Julius Malema saying that she is an attorney by profession, and therefore she should be able to substantiate and speak about the law with authority. So that is where we are at the moment, Xoli. Quite the scene as you saw it unfold. We expect that she will continue facing such questions, and of course to really substantiate how she, as well as Paul O'Sullivan, got involved in IPID investigations. You'll remember that yesterday the former state prosecutor advocate Michael Mashuga actually said that for Paul O'Sullivan, as well as Sarah Jane Trent, did have undue influence within IPID. In fact, he also cited Section 33, subsection 2 of the Act, which stipulates that members of IPID or investigators may not willfully disclose any information that is confidential in their investigations to private persons. And that is why in 2017 they were arrested, some IPID officials, Mandla Mahlangu, as well as Sarah Jane Trent and Paul O'Sullivan were arrested in relation to the investigations that they were conducting into former acting National Police Commissioner Khomotso Phahlane Qoli.
Zoleka, I want us to actually stay with that theme because you now take us back to what happened yesterday, and it ties in with what or where the line of questioning is leading, because Advocate Mashugha testified yesterday to the extent that he said what Sarah Jane Trent, alongside her boss, Paul O'Sullivan at the time, alongside Robert McBride, what they did was to subvert the mandate of the IPID Act in order to pursue Khomotso Phahlane, and in his sense, or in his words, that this was illegal. Take us back to some of what he had to say around that.
So let's just zone in on that particular investigation that was being conducted in relation to former acting National Police Commissioner Khomotso Phahlane. There was an investigation into the 80,000 Rand sound system. Paul O'Sullivan, as well as former executive director at IPID, Robert McBride, had also testified that that sound system was, his acquisition of that sound system was not legal because it was through a service provider for the SAPS. You'll remember as well, Goli, that the Action SA's Darylene James had actually said as well that that transaction, there was an addition of 500,000 Rand. And so there was something untoward about what had been taking place. You'll also remember that Advocate Michael Mashugha yesterday also said that they managed to gain entry into Khomotso Phahlane's property at Sable Hills. And so that is also something that Paul O'Sullivan actually earlier today denied, saying that they did not gain entry into his property. Because what took place, as we understand it, is that Mandla Mahlangu, Sarah Jane Trent, as well as Paul O'Sullivan, went to his property. And what Mandla Mahlangu then said is that Paul O'Sullivan should have represented them because the engagement with a white man would be much more appreciated than with that of a black man. And so that is why Paul O'Sullivan sort of took the leading role in those investigations. But you'll also remember that there was an engagement between himself today with the Patriotic Alliance's Ashley Souls, in that Paul O'Sullivan did not disclaim that he was not with IPID. Therefore, because the contingent that was present at Khomotso Phahlane's property was known to be from IPID, there was no reasonable reason why someone would believe that he was not part of that contingent because he was traveling with them. Therefore, it was reasonable for someone to deduce that they were traveling as an IPID contingent. But also, they got access to the building plans of his home, as well as trying to also gain access to the property. And that is what Advocate Mashugha said yesterday, that essentially this portrayal, this stance that was adopted by Sarah Jane Trent, as well as Paul O'Sullivan, essentially meant that they were impersonating IPID officials, and that is why they were then arrested in 2017. But you'll remember that that case did not see the light of day because of unreasonable delays as per Section 324A of the Criminal Procedures Act.
All right, Zoleka, I want you to remain where you are while we wait for the committee members to go back. And we're going to keep this conversation going because now what we're going to bring you is a snippet of what Paul O'Sullivan told the committee today about his alleged takeover of IPID. And let's hear him trying to explain to members that this wasn't, in fact, the case, that he essentially took over IPID.
Chairman, I stand by the submission that I've made to the Commission, to the committee, with all the evidence, and I believe that the evidence speaks for itself. Over 36 years, I have done my best to help in the fight against crime, and like any other situation, some of it might have been imperfect, but where I've made mistakes, I've tried to rectify them. I have in no way, shape or form attempted to take over.
All right, we're going to cut Paul O'Sullivan short because the committee members are back.